Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Living in Space resource for Space Week 2025. My name is Rob. I'm the National Outreach Coordinator for Space Week in Ireland, along with my colleagues Danielle and Francis here from MTU's Blackrock Castle Observatory. And today we're going to discuss the topic of living in space and how you can explore that further in the classroom with some amazing resources that Francis has developed and others from the European Space Agency, NASA, and others. So to kick things off, guys, I think the most important question to ask is if you were given the opportunity to live in space, would you?
No,
Under any circumstance, Francis?
no, it's dangerous. People die doing it. No, my head is in the stars, but my feet are so firmly on the ground. Good luck to those of you who want to go to space. I am not one of you.
I think I'd have a hard time living on another planet or something like that. Like if I was far away. I don't like the idea of being so far away from my family, but I think like if I were to live for maybe a month or something, I'd maybe even a year, like up on the ISS, I think that'd be kind of cool.
Yeah, funnily enough, I think that the toughest part for me, having spoken to a few astronauts about this now, is that they all say the food is terrible. I'm not sure I could go without like appreciating
Okay,
spicy food for a year.
can I just say the food isn't terrible? The food is the food that we have, okay? It's freeze dried or tinned. It's made up with water because there's water recycling. What is terrible is their noses because they're in microgravity. There is a fluid shift. Their heads get puffy, their legs get chickeny. So all that normally drained out isn't. So imagine, you know what it's like when you eat with a stuffy nose. It doesn't taste good because you can't smell it properly and everything just a little bit bad. So that is bad because they're equivalent of eating with a stuffy nose for the entire time. Do you remember we've got a patron, Dan Tanney, and he said they wait for the fresh food and they eat the onions like they're apples because they can just crunch into them and get a real taste that goes through the puffy head swelling that they have. Ah,
Mm.
another reason not to go. I don't want to be eating an onion like an apple.
That wouldn't bother me in the slightest. I have, well, since moving to Ireland, it's chronically springtime here all the time, and everything's always blooming. When somebody that has sinus issues, I always have a clogged, stuffy nose, and I eat oats and blueberries every morning. So, like, this is my ritual. I would be totally fine in space. I don't care if I never ate another spice as long as I lived.
They can't cook in space, you know that?
I love
There's
it.
a
I don't like cooking.
warming oven. All right. There was an American astronaut who attempted to cook her Thanksgiving dinner using the warming oven. It took her a day. All
Shit,
right.
yeah.
Just to cook a few onions to season and add. No, I like my food. I like my food. I like cooking my food. I don't want to have to be adding hot sauce. And you realize there's no bread. Bread
Oh,
makes crumbs. Those crumbs
big.
go
All
everywhere.
right.
So if you look up my favorite mustachioed Canadian astronaut, he makes tortillas with honey.
Hmm.
Yeah, see, the bread thing could be a deal breaker for me. I don't know if I could live life that way.
Well, the impact that you
Another
mentioned there,
thing,
Francis, about the swelling sinus is a really good kind of jumping off point to discuss, like with your students, what biological impacts you might anticipate from a microgravity environment versus those that we've documented. Like what, asking your students, what do you think life in microgravity might do to the body? It kind of forces them to start thinking about what gravity does to our bodies here on Earth. Like it compresses us, it makes us shorter. So we have seen that astronauts come back and they're a little bit taller for a few days because they don't have that gravitational pressure. Our bones
but
are stronger.
humans do that every morning. If you
This
measure
is
your height when
true.
you get out of bed, that's taller than you'll be at the end of the day.
Hmm. There's actually a fantastically useful study that NASA performed on twins. There was astronauts Mark and Scott Kelly. One went up onto the International Space Station while one stayed on Earth, and obviously they're so biologically similar. It was a really, really useful way to measure the impact of space on the body relative to what it's like to live on Earth. And they did find some interesting things. So people were a little bit worried about the immune system in space and whether it would function normally. And they did find that it didn't seem to be the case. So they were able to give a flu shot on the International Space Station and it seemed to work appropriately.
Hmm.
They did find that there was a change in something called a telomere, which are these little caps on the end of your chromosomes that are linked to aging and death. So that's obviously a really interesting area to explore in terms of therapies that we might have to develop for long-term space flight, but also just better understanding why we age and like how it affects our chromosomes here on Earth. So that study is well worth digging into in a bit more depth with your students to explore the impact of space travel on the body.
Yeah, not for me. Not for me. I heard that there's actually changes to the eye, and those
Yes.
can be long-term changes to the eye. And it's very much an active research because right now, if you go to space, you go to the International Space Station, you go into low Earth orbit, you're 400 kilometers up, you're not very far away from the Earth. With the Artemis missions planning to go back to the moon, we could have astronauts a little bit further away from space. And of course, there are some companies with the target of let's get to Mars. And I think living on Mars would be very, very different. And that what we learn about living aboard the International Space Station with the microgravity environment doesn't necessarily translate to living on another planet. And I think it could be interesting that we've plenty of science fiction stories about living on Mars, about the thinner atmosphere not blocking out the radiation from the sun and from external to the solar system radiation. You know, humans in a high radiation environment isn't a good combination. So I
Mhm.
think it's interesting by all means to see the space station, but that's not the only place we're ever going to go to space. And I
Mhm.
think going to Mars is going to throw up a whole lot of issues.
See, that's where I have issues with going, like I said, going to another planet and like Mars would be the next best option. We're not going to Venus. It's going to melt us, suffocate us, burn us alive. We're not doing that. So Mars, not going to do that, but it's colder there and it's not going to burn us alive. And it's rocky, so we can walk on it and so we can build things on it, which is great. Um, it's the distance though. So like I said, being far away from my family, it's one thing, even here, I'm far away from my family. My family's in the United States. I'm in Ireland, but I can call my mother and have a phone call with her, and there's no issues. If I go all the way to Mars, that's a lot farther away. So when you think about the distance, sometimes we look in like textbooks and they look like Earth and Mars are right next to each other. They're not. They're quite far.
Well,
Go on, Francis.
I like the fact that because Mars goes round roughly twice as much, it goes, you know, takes twice as long to go around the sun as we do. So your launch window is at a particular time when Earth is catching up to Mars, and you're only going to be 5 or 6 months to get there. But in those 6 months, the Earth goes to the other side of its orbit,
Yeah,
and Mars only goes a quarter of the way around. So you can't turn around and come back.
that's
So
a big
one
issue.
estimate I've seen is you want to go to Mars and back, it's 1,000 days away from
Right.
home.
Right. So like
Mhm.
the International Space Station, while it's far away, is right there. We can look up and see it at night. It's what, 400 kilometers away? Is that what it
Yeah.
is from the Earth's surface? It's not that far. So then we're talking if you want to go to the moon, getting in a rocket, you're 3 days. So that's still a good journey, but like I've gone to Australia, it took me nearly 2 days to get there. So 3 days, not that bad. But getting all the way out to Mars and taking what, like on average about 8 months could be more to get out there. That's one way. Then, if I were to have a phone call with my mother, that distance between Earth and Mars is so long, the phone call itself would take 20 minutes in between.
Mhm.
So if you were to have a conversation and I spoke, "Hi, Mom," it takes 20 minutes for her to hear that. And I said, "Hi, Danielle,"
And get the
20
response
minutes to
back.
come back. That's not an easy conversation to have.
I know. I got to say,
Like,
there is a science fiction film where they were having a conversation at distance. And after the first few time lapses, they seemed to forget that it was a thing. And they just started talking back and forth. I was like, no, that would have taken a day to have that
Yeah,
conversation.
right,
Okay.
right.
It's a bit like you need to leave a voice message for someone, and then they can
That's,
get back to you with everything they want to say. It's
yeah,
not a conversation time.
right.
What you guys are getting at there is kind of the key to properly exploring the World Space Week theme this year, which is living in space. We already know we can survive in space. The issue isn't so much can we, it's how long can we survive in space for? Because we've established it's bad for us, and the longer you're up there, the worse it is for you. So, for instance, the impact of osteoporosis on your bone, it's about 1% density loss per month in space. So that's not so bad if you're going up for 3 months, but if you're going to Mars and spending a long
Mm.
time there, that's going to be a lot of impact on your bones. Getting more speculative, if we're talking about like inhabiting the solar system and traveling to other star systems, which is very, very speculative, but it is, fun to explore. You're talking about things like generational ships. If we want to go explore another star system, it will be a case whereby and again, this is very speculative and well into the future, but you would be talking about astronauts leaving Earth with the intention of their descendants reaching another solar system. And that's going to be tricky because pregnancy is actually dependent on gravity. There are very, very important impacts of pregnancy on the human body during development. So, for the first two-thirds of a pregnancy, the fetus is basically neutrally buoyant. It's so small and so light that it's basically floating around inside there, and the impacts of gravity on it aren't so great. But as it gets heavier and starts to effectively weigh 60 to 80% of its actual weight, that's when gravity starts impacting things like the strength of the heart, because the heart needs to be able to push blood up and around the body, which it does when we're standing here on Earth. But if you're in a microgravity situation, your heart isn't being forced to develop that strength. Same thing goes for your spinal muscles. So we'd have to figure out ways to engineer artificial gravity to protect the health of fetuses if we were trying to even just send pregnant people into space, even if it wasn't for long-term space travel. So these are all, it's just really hard to consider all the different ways that our environment shapes our body because we're so
Mm.
immersed in it that going into space and anticipating all the ways that it will impact us is really, really difficult.
I think one
But
thing to keep in mind though is that there's gravity in space. I think we think a lot that like there's no gravity. So those things would only impact like pregnancy, for example, it only affect an astronaut that's in microgravity, that's in like on a spaceship going through space. But if you were on
yeah.
Mars, you're not in no gravity. You've got gravity there. It's just less than Earth. So what we could see if you were on Mars and you were pregnant, you could see the fetus getting to my understanding now, I'm not a biologist, but I think that there's a possibility it could get too large for the body. I think that's what it is. So you might end up seeing, you'd have to see adaptations to how pregnancy works and how to make sure that you're having safe pregnancies and not like something out of Alien where the baby's bursting out of the
Oh, you're
woman's
just
body.
making it even less likely that I'm ever gonna want to go to space. I'm thinking even just the engineering structure, let alone the effects on the human body. It costs money to go to space. All right. Depending on which spacecraft you're on, depending on, how that spacecraft has been built, it costs money. All right. And it's generally the comparison between spacecraft is made by how many tens of thousands of US dollars per kilogram to go to space. All right. SpaceX, if they can get themselves sorted to launch more frequently, they might be able to drop the price. And this is considering the development of the spacecraft, the fueling, all the staffing, everything's kind of related with it. And it's tricky to compare, but we've got numbers that we can share with you about what does it cost to go to space. So what are you going to take to space given how much it costs? All right. There's a limit to, you can't, just because you can think of it, you can't necessarily put it in space. So I know the Artemis mission is looking very much at the lunar surface being the lunar material, the regolith, being a building block for any future base on the moon. So you're not going to send your moon structures, you're going to make your moon structures. And European Space Agency is looking at a kind of a 3D printing using the raw material that's already on the moon to make your lunar base. So how much can we ingeniously come up with a way to use what's out there? If you go to Mars, well, Mars hasn't got any life on it. So your fuel source when you get to Mars, there's no coal, there's no oil, There's no gas, there's no fossil fuels at all because there's no fossils. So you're going to be looking at wind or solar. Geothermal, I guess, would be Mars thermal or nuclear. All right. So you're limited in what you can use for energy sources. And right now, you're not allowed to send nuclear reactors into space. There's space treaties that stop you powering your spacecraft with nuclear reactors. You can have a kind of a nuclear battery, but we can't send a nuclear reactor. So you're limited about what you're going to do for energy. You want to use solar power on Mars? Better hope it's not a sandstorm as your solar powers. Isn't that in the film The Martian? Well, it's in the book. In the book, The Martian, he's going into a sandstorm and slowly his solar output is decreasing because it's too sandy. So there's lots of options to consider. How are you physically engineeringly, let alone then going to have babies? I think the engineering is the big issue.
And you're farther away from the sun as well. So even just the distance, you're getting less energy from the sun. So you're gonna have to create more solar energy. Like you'd have to have longer hours with the sun to be able to fill up your batteries
So
than what
bigger
you would have
panels,
here on Earth. Yeah.
bigger panels. So if you look at some of the spacecraft, unmanned spacecraft that have gone exploring our solar system, big solar panels. All right, is one way to get around the issue.
And the engineering challenges of just creating structures on another planet like Mars or even the moon, uh, as I was doing research for this, it just struck me how like the most basic stuff we take for granted here on Earth becomes like the idea that you could just go put concrete up there, for instance. You can't because the moon goes from like daytime highs of 121 degrees Celsius, I think, down to lows of like negative 131 or something like that. But that's a 200-degree swing. We're
Yep.
already seeing roads here fail because of the impact of climate change. It just gets that little bit warmer, and all of a sudden, the buildings we've built for one climate are starting to fail. So that's probably a really interesting exercise you can do with your
Sounds a lot like
students.
Buffalo. I'd say if you send the engineers from there, they'd be able to build stuff no problem.
Well, there you go. Like
Sorry,
that's
I've
what I was
driven
going to
through Buffalo.
suggest.
Those engineers do not know how to make roads.
It's a really interesting challenge. Like, for instance, just talk to your students and ask them, can you think of materials, just general materials that can withstand extreme heat, but also withstand extreme cold? And that's really, really hard to come by. A lot of plastics will start to fracture, a lot of glass will start to fracture, a lot of metals will start to experience strain. It's not that easy to find a material that can handle those extremes. And we're talking about this from the context of space and how that's, an interesting hypothetical, but it also presents some interesting discussions for what the future of life on Earth might look like. I don't know how familiar you guys are with the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional. I can never remember the actual the acronym. It's the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. Basically, the North Atlantic Drift, the thing that keeps Ireland temperate.
Oh.
So, for however many hundreds of years that we've had an Irish society, we've been operating in a system that's temperate. It's never that hot, never that cold. It's always just meh. If we suddenly
It's
become
lovely.
like, if we suddenly become like a buffalo because the AMOC fails and we don't get that temperate continuity and we actually have extreme highs and extreme
Just to
lows.
clarify, we're talking about Buffalo, New York, not the animal like a buffalo.
Yes.
Yes, just to clarify.
But Buffalo, New York is actually a relatively good. I think Anchorage was the example that the climate expert John Gibbons gave of what Irish climate could look like without the AMOC.
Mm.
Our buildings are not built for those extremes. Like we saw the Beast from the East, just how much it disrupted Irish life when it came in. Our vehicles struggle to deliver goods around the country because we're not built for driving on snow and ice, etc. So just anticipating like the difference that the temperature alone could make to life on Earth, and exploring like what that would look like in an Irish context is a really interesting like follow-on exercise if you're trying to link climate change into the challenges of living in space. But Francis, one of the resources that I was looking at in terms of what we have is space is trying to kill you. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
That pointed out
Space
a
is.
really interesting one for me that I actually didn't know about. I knew lunar regolith was sticky, I knew, so lunar regolith is basically the fancy word for space soil, or for moon soil, rather. Uh, but I always in my mind had just anticipated it just being this fine, sugary powder. But it's not as sharp, really sharp. Why is that?
There's no erosion on the moon. So the rocks that on this planet are rolled around by water, rolled around by air, are just broken by meteorite impacts. And if you break something, like drop a plate, does it make little rounded bits? No, it makes sharp, jaggedy bits depending on where the impact was. So the astronauts who've been to the moon said that the moon dust stuck to their space, their suits. And if they were taking something off, the outer part of it was just horrible to breathe in, sharp and jaggedy. It would affect them as they would inhale it. So they were very, very careful to just minimize the amount of this dust. And they said it stuck to everything because it was sharp and jagged and just engaged and got onto the fabric of the suits. Everything got coated with a gray dust. So that's just not good stuff to breathe.
Wow.
Obviously,
It
you're only
really
going to breathe
is.
it if you bring it in to a pressurized environment.
But given how sticky it is, it's going to be very difficult not to. I mean, I think that
I know.
was something that the first, was it Apollo 11 were commenting on, was it was really hard to keep that stuff out of the command
Yeah,
module because it was
yeah,
sticking to everything.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and it's interesting to me that when we first planned to go to the moon, we weren't sure what the surface of the moon was made of. We didn't know whether there was layers and layers of this powdered material that they'd sink into, or whether it was more of a kind of a solid surface with maybe a little bit of powder above it, because radar detection couldn't really tell the difference. And so the very first landers were designed with the big lily pad feet, just in case they were going to sink. I
I
think that's
I
cool.
think about that a lot actually. Like the thought of the guys landing on the moon for the first time and stepping off that ladder, that had to have been terrifying. They didn't know what they were stepping into. Imagine they just sunk straight in. Like that's scary. Like nobody was coming to get them out.
Yeah. That's the other thing. The psychological effect of being so far away and being on your own.
Mhm.
I pack my car to go to music festivals. And I'm always aware that, there's not going to be a lot of shops at a music festival, but I don't need. But I have multiple checklists. Do I have my tent? Do I have my chair? Do I have my sleeping bag? The list for going to space, there's no shops. You
Mm.
don't bring it with you, you don't have it.
Mhm.
And it's not easy to do resupplies. So it's interesting to see with the plans to going to the moon, how much will have to be set up in advance. Initial missions to put the materials that you're going to need. And I think for any trip to Mars, that's going to have to happen. That there must be initial unmanned drop your stuff off, because otherwise you can't take everything with you in the one go.
What about
And
even
then,
doctors? Like what if he got an off? Imagine like Neil Armstrong stepping off of the ladder and I have very weak ankles. I twist them all the time, as we saw last Space Week when I was roaming around in a boot and in a wheelchair. What if he came down like how I did and just twisted wrong and boom, snapped his ankle? Then what? Hobbling around the moon. What do we do with medical issues? What if someone needs medical attention, like an appendix bursts or someone has a heart attack? Do they just broke on the moon?
well, there
That
was
actually,
one American astronaut. He was a politician, and he is now the metric for how space sick you can get. He just, yeah, aboard the International Space Station, it didn't suit him, and he threw up. I thought he may have just been with a space shuttle. He was just sick and sick
Mm,
and sick. Now he was on a short mission. I think it was a space shuttle mission. He was going back in 5 or 10 days. But oh my goodness. And just how would you feel knowing that you're letting the side down? You're there to
yeah.
do a job, you're there to work as a team. I've heard from astronauts that sometimes they don't always get along with the other astronauts. And of course, they don't wash their clothing. They just wear the clothing till it's too stinky to wear. So I understand there is a kind of a, this is where I'm working. You go work over there. So I don't have to smell you with my stuffy nose. But just, you're there to do a job. But how do the personal skills of astronauts help that job?
Mm.
How do you get on with people?
When I
No.
talk to students about traveling to Mars too, I always say to them, what's the longest trip you've ever taken? And some of them are like, oh, I've gone up to Dublin. And then every now and then you get kids who go, oh, I went to Australia or South Africa or something like that. And I was like, think about how long it took for you when you were in that plane. Imagine being stuck inside of there with your classmates, 8 months, and you can't get out, you can't open the window, and you have to get along, and you have to be behave yourselves. And you have to make sure you like the people on board because it's going to be a long journey and you can't go anywhere. That's something to consider if you are thinking about becoming an astronaut.
I think the fact that we've lived through the coronavirus pandemic and have experienced the impact of lockdown and being kind of confined to a local area in many cases is a really interesting experience that your students can draw on as a way to like anticipate what it might be like to live in an environment like a space habitat or just a prolonged journey to a space habitat, for instance. I myself, I was in a position where I got to initially be locked in space on my own. So during the first lockdown, I lived alone in a really, really small apartment. And afterwards, when we were able to move to another apartment, and then I was living with somebody else and we were locked down again, I saw the two different sides of it. One, the isolation of being alone, and in the second instance, where you're just on top of people all the time and how they're
Mm.
two completely different challenges and they impact you psychologically in very different ways. And I think it would be really interesting for your students to reflect back on, well, what was it like during the pandemic when I was maybe with my family all the time and I couldn't get away from them and we were just always within earshot and had no privacy. How did that feel? I know imagine you're doing that without any of the like comforts of home. How would
Hmm.
you last?
Yeah. I have actually said, I remember during the pandemic, I said, this is going to produce some pretty good astronauts.
Mhm.
Mm.
We do have a good friend, Dr. Neve Shaw, who has done what we call analog missions, where she has basically pretended to be on Mars um, in, I think it was the Utah desert.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
she had, did daily logs as if she was on Mars and talked about what she missed and how like life changed. And I read one of the reports, like the daily log reports, and it was funny. She mentioned just how useless money felt. They found a piece of currency, and they're like, this has absolutely no value here. The best thing we could do with it is clean our boots and how it was the most important thing in the world only a few days prior to coming in because they needed it to buy supplies, etc. But the priorities when you're in that situation versus when you're free to live your life on Earth just change so dramatically. And we'll link to that resource below so that you can read a little bit more about Neve's time in an analog mission. And I think we've done similar kind of analog mission resources in the past, Francis, that we can maybe
Yeah.
link to.
Yeah, we've looked at that. And interesting enough, one of our European partners is coordinating what will be the world's biggest analog mission. They are with the Austrian Space Forum, and they will be running the mission control for an analog mission with participants around the world. And that's coming up at Space Week this year.
Awesome. One of the other things that we haven't really touched on yet, but I think is interesting, and I'm reminded of it because last year we were joined by Steve Swanson. He helped with growing lettuce on the International Space Station, and he got to harvest it. I think it was like the first harvest in space of a
Mhm.
particular type of lettuce or
Mhm.
something. Um, but it is something that the European Space Agency and I'm sure other space agencies are looking at with a lot of interest is providing fresh food in space. And if we are somewhere, as you mentioned, Francis, like Mars, where it's harder to get
Mhm.
consistent drops, it's going to be important to be able to at least subsidize these drops with some food grown freshly. And I found that that was a really, really interesting challenge to think about what crops could you grow in space and what crops absolutely couldn't and what kind of challenges that poses. So something like, for instance, fruits. Uh, usually the trees need to grow for quite a long time and they only crop for a very short period. And while they're very, very useful in terms of vitamin content, so things like vitamin C, they're not necessarily the best in terms of like
Mhm.
consistent nutritional output. They take up a lot of space for very little nutritional output. The opposite end of that spectrum then is something like lettuce, which apparently is growing really, really well in space, and it's very, very easy to grow in space. And it has vitamins and everything, but it's just calorifically kind of useless. That they joke that if you eat lettuce, you burn more calories chewing it than you actually gain from eating it. So trying to find crops that are the right balance between take up a little bit of space and grow quickly versus have good nutritional output is a really, really interesting challenge for future astronauts. And even some of the tests that they've done on the ISS, I think it was in 1995, they grew some potatoes. And potatoes are one of the crops that they're looking at as one that doesn't take up a ton of space, has a pretty high yield for the amount of space that it does take up, um, and is relatively easy to grow. But like, do you guys feel that there are other crops that are like really important to us on a daily basis that we wouldn't realize we'd miss very quickly?
I think it's almost the variety of crops. I know Danielle loves her blueberries and her oats, and I have a pretty regular morning routine as well, but I like a variety of food in my diet. And I think what the space station has shown us is sure that growing the lettuce isn't nutritionally valuable, but it's a living thing in a space that is otherwise quite mechanical, quite devoid of even, a potted plant to go say hello to in the morning. So I think the psychological value of it right now is the most important part of it. And the
Mm.
nutritional is going to come in because we do have background in hydroponic growing. You don't take soil to space. You do your best to grow in a hydroponic way. So a water-based, your roots are getting what they need without the benefit of the soil. But it's interesting that the European Space Agency Education has Astro Farmer, Astro Food, some nice resources to let particularly primary age students look at what kind of foods can they grow and would they be suitable or not for a microgravity environment aboard the ISS.
I
And
think
we'll of course
my
link to
biggest
those
issue,
resources.
yes, of course. I think my biggest issue would be coffee. I am very religious about every morning. It's a routine for me more than anything. So like I enjoy going to a cafe and get coffee, but on a regular basis, I have my French press, I have my grinder, I grind my beans every morning. It's a whole routine for me. And when I'm away and I have to like on if I do business trips or something like that, and then I come back, the thing I'm the most excited for is making my own coffee in the morning, the way I like to do it. And that would not be a very efficient way to have coffee on the ISS the way that I do it in the morning. So it's not even just it's the coffee itself because I like the way it tastes when I do it. But also it's that routine of doing and making the coffee that I would miss.
Yeah. The As I said, it's probably the single biggest barrier to me going to space is the lack of food. And I remember Steve talking when we took him on the road trip, he was very, very excited to get spicy food anytime he could because he was just constantly talking about how much they missed the spicy stuff when they were in space. It is an interesting comparison to draw, I guess. When we think about it from an Irish context, like one of the crops they are very seriously looking at is potatoes. And we do eat a reasonable amount of potatoes here in Ireland, not quite as much as people maybe think we do. But perhaps like the most important grain on the planet is rice. Like it's probably eaten by more people than any other one, and it's just not suitable for living or for growing in space as we currently would have to grow it. It takes far too much water for too low a yield, and that might be a big cultural issue for one thing for people who are used to eating rice all the time. But it's just an interesting thought that if we ever did manage to successfully set up a base on another planetary body or a moon to the point where you actually were creating locally produced food, just how different the food cultures might be on the moon from Earth, or how different just culture in general might be. And that kind of brings us to another interesting area that you touched on, Francis, is like the psychology of space. Like we can't
Mm.
bring everything we want to bring with us. It's just too heavy. But what
I
would be
know, but
so
saying
important that we would
that,
have to?
the European Space Agency, for some of their recent astronauts, worked for culturally suitable food. So French astronauts have worked with French chefs to produce 2 or 3 items that are added in to the selection of what you can choose from. So astronauts aboard the ISS can choose food that they want to have accompany them. So there's a store of food there that people haven't finished eating, or maybe somebody was aboard the ISS and they've gone, but this food is still, they don't take the food away. If it's got to space, it stays in space. So this fabulous Thomas Pesquet took his own chef-designed French food. How fabulous.
Very cool. I do like how the challenges of trying to grow some of these crops in space as well is going to help us improve how we grow them on Earth. I know that they were looking at like ways of detoxifying soil to improve the capacity of potatoes to grow in them. But that's something that will actually help us here on Earth as well in areas where the soil conditions are poor. So it's, I think very often people ask, why are we going to space? It's really expensive. It's a bit of a luxury, etc. But it does eventually feed back into benefiting us here on Earth as well. But yeah, leaning into that psychology aspect of it, I do think it would be a really cool exercise to ask students, like if you had to pack
Yeah.
whatever it is, let's say just a suitcase, and this is all you can bring with you of like your life here on Earth, what's important to you in Ireland. Can you, like, for instance, if you like hurling, can you hurl on a moon village? If we created one, how would it change, to be an Irish person participating in Irish sports on another planetary body? Could you do it? Would it just change the rules? Would the schlitter go that little bit further? Uh, you know, Bringing instruments with you, because I know Irish people have a particular affinity for traditional music. Was it Katie Coleman, I think, brought a flute to space that was played by one of the Furies? Like,
Yeah.
those are the kind of
And
things that
Chris
I
Hadfield
wonder.
had his guitar in space.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an issue with those. You have to be very careful what you bring. Like, you're not allowed to bring a stuffed animal up with you to space because it'll outgas whatever was in the spongy foam that's filling it.
Mm.
What's outgassing? What's coming out of it? So there's real restrictions about, you can't just bring anything. Although saying that, I have a postcard over here that did go to space. It was one of the items that astronauts can often take with them, is small little items that then they can bring back and give out. So I have a postcard here that's been to space. So I sometimes ask students, and we have a nice resource on this at spaceweek.com, spaceweek.ie, we'll share that with you, about what would your class want to take, and would it fit? How heavy is it? How much space does it take up? How much would it cost?
I like that. So yeah, as I said, we'll link to all of these resources. And that kind of brings us to that final. What got me thinking about this was I've seen these ideas for space habitats, and they always seem kind of small and cramped. And in science fiction, they always seem very impersonal, but they're usually barren and devoid of any kind of color or personality. But we did see a really interesting talk from Orla Punch, who's an Irish architect who did some work on space art architect. She was did a talk for us in University of Limerick with Zero Ireland for Space Careers Roadshow, where she talked about space architecture, what the future of it might look like, but was very, very keen to include personality as part of it. And she spoke of Galina Balashova, I think her name was, who was one of the first potential space architects to include things like color, because she thought it was that important, that it would be a pleasant environment for the astronauts. But also as a way to help delineate where areas were in a zero gravity environment. Because when you think about it, we don't, if we have a ceiling and a floor here. If you're on the International Space Station, you don't. So color coding the different walls, for instance, gives you kind of a shared perspective of, well, where's up, where's down, in that space. And I just thought it was a really, really cool idea to start thinking about ways that we can use decoration to improve the psychology and the stress that astronauts experience on that front.
And I think it's interesting to notice one of the more recent additions to the ISS is the cupola that lets you look out and see the Earth. Instead of looking through a little tiny porthole, they have big, large windows, and it's a favorite place to gather to see your connection to your home planet that you're orbiting.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent reflection to end on, the importance of being able to look back at Earth from space, because even though it is cool that we can live in space, and we all probably agree that maybe not us specifically, but other people should be living in space. Uh, that actually is a good debate as well. That maybe to finish on is I find debate is a really, really good exercise for getting students to explore a topic. Just have half the class be pro space exploration, half the class be anti space exploration. And we have resources on this as well, don't we? For I think it was Mars, and whether we should
We have
explore
should
Mars.
we go to Mars?
There you go. So we can explore that as a topic, and we'll obviously include that as well in the list below. But I think, yeah, should we live in space long term is a really interesting debate that I would encourage you and your students to have, while touching on all of these issues that we've touched on here. We'll give you far more resources that you can send your students with to help them explore this in much more detail. Um, I do think we should point out that a lot of these resources have been developed by Frances herself over the years, and we're very, very grateful to Frances for all the work she has done on Space Week over the years, and we're very, very lucky to have someone like Frances working on them. So thank you very much for that, Frances. And
Wasn't just me, there's a whole education team.
there's a whole education team, including Danielle as well. So we're very, very, very grateful to have had Danielle these past few years. She's very much become the face of Space Weeks. So thank you both, and thank all the teachers who joined us today to find ways to help engage their students with Space Week. You're the reason that Space Week Ireland is one of the best performing Space Weeks in the world every year. We couldn't do it without teachers all over Ireland getting their students motivated. So from us to you, thank you very, very much.
Come on, Vulcan, say hello.
Live long and prosper,
Oh
folks.
no, I'm a Star Wars fan.
Oh.